Late November, 1943. Dawn settles slowly over a prisoner-of-war camp somewhere in the American interior. The barracks are quiet, built of raw timber, their windows clouded by cold air and breath. Inside, German soldiers, captured months earlier on distant battlefields, pull on worn jackets and step into formation. This morning feels no different from the others. The war is still raging across Europe. Home is still far away. They move toward the mess hall in silence. Boots crunch on gravel. The smell in the air is unfamiliar, heavier than usual. Not thin soup. Not bread alone. Something roasted. Inside, metal trays slide along wooden counters. Steam rises. Ladles pause. Then come portions that do not match expectation. Thick slices of meat. Pale and brown skin. Stuffing pressed beside it. Potatoes. Bread. And something green. For a moment, no one speaks. Some prisoners stare. Others glance at one another, unsure if this is temporary, symbolic, or mistaken. They had been told captivity would mean hunger. Instead, on this morning, they are handed a Thanksgiving turkey. And with that single meal, an unspoken question begins to form. How did the enemy end up feeding them like this? By the time those trays were filled in November 1943, the war had already reshaped the world beyond recognition. Germany, once on the offensive across Europe and North Africa, was now losing men in numbers it could no longer replace easily. Entire formations had surrendered far from home. The Afrika Korps collapsed in Tunisia in May 1943. Earlier defeats at El Alamein and Stalingrad had already signaled a strategic reversal. German soldiers were being captured not by dozens, but by tens of thousands. The Allies faced an unexpected problem: where to put them. Britain, already under constant strain from bombing and rationing, could not house the growing number of prisoners alone. North Africa was unstable. The Mediterranean remained contested. The solution emerged across the Atlantic. The United States, vast, secure, industrially intact, would become one of the largest holding grounds for enemy soldiers in modern history. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States. They arrived by ship under tight security, crossing the same ocean once dominated by U-boats. Upon arrival, they were dispersed across a nationwide network of camps stretching from Texas to Wisconsin, from Arizona deserts to New England forests. Over 500 facilities, large base camps and smaller branch camps, were established, often near farms, rail lines, or military installations. These camps were not improvised. They were planned, standardized, and administered by the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office. Layouts were functional: barracks, guard towers, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation yards. Barbed wire enclosed the perimeter, but beyond it lay open land, highways, and towns that had never seen war firsthand. The men inside those fences came from different corners of the German military. Wehrmacht infantry, Luftwaffe ground crews, submarine sailors captured when their boats surfaced or sank. Some were veterans hardened by years of fighting. Others were barely out of training. Many still believed in eventual victory. Some did not. What united them was uncertainty, and a shared expectation shaped by years of propaganda. German soldiers had been warned about capture, especially by the Americans. They were told the enemy was brutal, undisciplined, and vengeful. That surrender meant humiliation, starvation, and punishment. These beliefs followed them onto transport ships and into American camps. In their minds, captivity was another front of the war. The United States, however, viewed the situation through a different lens. The war effort required labor. American farms were short of workers as millions of citizens served overseas. Railroads, lumber operations, and agricultural regions needed manpower. At the same time, Washington understood that how it treated prisoners would be watched closely. By neutral inspectors, by allies, and by Germany itself, which still held American POWs in Europe. This dual pressure, practical necessity and international scrutiny, shaped U.S. policy from the beginning. Prisoners were to be controlled, not brutalized. Productive, not broken. Alive, healthy, and accounted for. Transportation inland removed POWs from combat zones and reduced escape risk. The geography itself became a form of security. A German soldier escaping in rural Nebraska or central Texas faced thousands of miles of unfamiliar terrain, language barriers, and a population largely supportive of the war effort. Few tried. Fewer succeeded. As the camps filled and routines stabilized, daily life settled into repetition. Roll calls. Work details. Meals served at fixed hours. News filtered in through guarded channels. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, Red Cross notices. The war outside continued to move, but inside the camps, time slowed. Yet beneath that routine lay tension. The prisoners watched everything. The quality of food. The conduct of guards. The absence of beatings. The presence of sports fields and libraries. None of it matched what they had been prepared to endure. And as autumn turned to winter in 1943, another unfamiliar concept approached, one rooted not in war, but in American tradition. A holiday that would bring the contrast between expectation and reality into sharp focus, and force both captors and captives to confront what captivity in this war truly meant. The framework governing every aspect of German captivity in the United States had been written long before the war began. The Geneva Convention of 1929, signed by both Germany and the United States, laid out precise obligations for the treatment of prisoners of war. It covered housing, labor, medical care, discipline, and food. Prisoners were to receive rations equivalent in quality and quantity to those of the captor's own base troops. For the U.S. Army, this was not an abstract principle. It was policy. Compliance was enforced through regulations, inspections, and reporting requirements that reached from Washington down to individual camp commanders. The International Red Cross inspected camps regularly. Their reports were filed, archived, and compared. Any deviation risked retaliation against American prisoners held by Germany. Food, in particular, carried strategic weight. By 1943, American civilians were living under rationing. Sugar, meat, butter, coffee, all were restricted. Posters urged conservation. Yet the United States remained the world's most productive agricultural power. Unlike Europe, its farmland was untouched by bombing. Rail networks functioned. Slaughterhouses operated at scale. The War Food Administration coordinated supply across civilian, military, and allied needs. Within this system, POW rations were calculated deliberately. They were not generous by luxury standards, but they were nutritionally complete. Meat appeared regularly. Bread was fresh. Vegetables were available. Calories were sufficient to sustain labor. For many German prisoners, especially those captured late in the war, this represented a noticeable improvement over front-line conditions or even civilian life back home. This disparity was not lost on anyone. American camp kitchens were run by U.S. Army cooks, often assisted by prisoners themselves. Men trained as bakers or butchers in civilian life were assigned to relevant duties. Menus were standardized but flexible, adapting to regional supply. Pork in the Midwest. Beef in Texas. Fresh produce where available. The goal was consistency, not indulgence. Holidays, however, introduced a complication. Thanksgiving was not a military requirement. It was a cultural observance deeply embedded in American identity. Within U.S. Army bases, it was marked by tradition. Special meals, turkey when possible, and brief pauses in routine. When POW camps expanded across the country, commanders faced a question that regulations did not explicitly answer. Should enemy prisoners share in these observances? There was no single order mandating Thanksgiving meals for POWs. Instead, guidance came indirectly. Prisoners were entitled to the same rations as base troops. If American soldiers received turkey, so would the prisoners. Not because they were guests, not as a gesture of kindness, but because policy allowed no visible exception. For German prisoners, the concept itself was foreign. Thanksgiving had no equivalent in their culture. They knew it only as an American holiday, often associated with abundance. Some assumed it would not apply to them. Others suspected it was a propaganda display, a temporary indulgence meant to deceive inspectors. German propaganda had prepared them to distrust such moments. Any humane treatment by the enemy was portrayed as manipulative, designed to weaken resolve or extract cooperation. Prisoners debated motives quietly in barracks. Was this confidence, arrogance, or something more dangerous, normalcy? Letters home complicated matters further. Under censorship rules, POWs were allowed to write to families. Many described camp life cautiously. Some mentioned food. When those letters reached Germany, they clashed sharply with reality on the home front. By late 1943, German civilians were enduring severe shortages. Meat was scarce. Holiday meals were modest or non-existent. The idea of enemy soldiers eating turkey while families in Hamburg or Berlin survived on substitutes carried emotional weight. American authorities were aware of this contradiction. They did not hide it, but neither did they advertise it. The camps were not designed to humiliate the enemy through excess. They were designed to function efficiently, predictably, and within the law. By November, preparations began quietly. Supply officers confirmed allocations. Kitchen staff planned menus. Guards were instructed to maintain routine discipline. No speeches were scheduled. No decorations were required. The day would look like any other, except for what appeared on the trays. For the prisoners, Thanksgiving arrived without explanation. No context. No announcement. Only the meal itself, placed in front of men who had been conditioned to expect punishment, not tradition. And it was in that unremarkable delivery, without ceremony, without justification, that the moment gained its power, setting the stage for reactions that would ripple far beyond a single afternoon in a mess hall. The human angle. For the German prisoners, the shock of Thanksgiving did not arrive as celebration. It arrived as disorientation. Hunger sharpens expectation. Months of regulated meals had trained them to anticipate sameness. Bread, stew, measured portions. The turkey disrupted that rhythm. Not because it was extravagant, but because it was intentional. Many prisoners ate slowly. Some hesitated. A few set portions aside, uncertain whether the meal would be reclaimed or followed by restriction. Food, in captivity, carried meaning beyond nutrition. It was power measured in calories. To receive more than expected created suspicion, not gratitude. Among enlisted men, reactions varied by experience. Veterans who had survived Stalingrad or North Africa recognized abundance immediately. They compared it silently to frozen rations, half-cooked meals, or days without meat. Younger soldiers, especially those captured earlier, struggled to reconcile the meal with everything they had been taught. No speeches accompanied the food. Guards did not explain. There were no cameras. That absence mattered. Without a narrative imposed from above, prisoners were left alone with the contradiction in front of them. The realization was not dramatic. It was quiet, internal, and unsettling. And it lingered. The moral angle. From the American perspective, the Thanksgiving meal was not a moral statement, but it became one regardless. The decision to feed enemy soldiers according to regulation, even during a national holiday, reflected an institutional commitment to restraint. Not mercy, restraint. The U.S. Army understood that war stripped humanity quickly. Discipline preserved it. By adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention, American leadership sought to maintain control not only over prisoners, but over its own conduct. Retaliation and cruelty were easy. Regulation required effort. This approach frustrated some guards. Many had brothers or friends fighting overseas. Some had lost family members. The idea that captured Germans would eat turkey while Americans rationed meat at home was difficult to accept. Yet enforcement was firm. Orders were followed. Deviations were punished. Thanksgiving meals, therefore, became a test, not for prisoners, but for the system. The camps passed that test by refusing to personalize the enemy. Prisoners were not Nazis in that moment. They were not symbols. They were detainees under law. This distinction mattered deeply in the long term. It reinforced a pattern prisoners would encounter repeatedly. Fairness without friendliness, structure without cruelty. The meal was not meant to soften them. But it did something more subtle. It removed the moral clarity many had relied on. If the enemy followed rules even when it did not have to, then the world was not as simple as propaganda had promised. The enemy perspective. For German prisoners, Thanksgiving exposed a fault line between ideology and observation. Nazi indoctrination had taught them that American society was decadent, disorganized, and morally weak. The camps contradicted that image daily, but the holiday meal made the contradiction impossible to ignore. This was not chaos. It was procedure. Officers debated it privately. Some dismissed the meal as psychological warfare. Others saw it as confidence. A nation secure enough to treat enemies well did not fear them. That realization unsettled hierarchical thinking ingrained in German military culture. Among enlisted men, conversations shifted. Not openly, not defiantly, but subtly. If Americans could afford to feed prisoners this way, what did that say about industrial capacity? About morale? About the trajectory of the war itself? Letters home became cautious. Censors removed detail. Prisoners learned what could be said and what could not. Even so, fragments slipped through. Families read about sufficient meals, about routine, about health. These accounts clashed violently with conditions inside Germany, where bombing, shortages, and exhaustion defined daily life. The contrast worked both ways. Some prisoners hardened their beliefs, insisting that appearances were deceptive. Others began reassessing quietly, piece by piece. The Thanksgiving meal did not change loyalty overnight, but it planted doubt, and doubt, once introduced, did not retreat easily. Importantly, the Americans did not exploit this doubt directly. There were no lectures, no forced re-education tied to the meal. That absence gave the experience credibility. Prisoners concluded that the treatment was genuine precisely because it was unremarkable. As the trays were cleared and the day passed without incident, the holiday faded back into routine. But something had shifted. Not in policy, not in discipline, in perception. The prisoners returned to barracks carrying more than full stomachs. They carried questions about the enemy, about the war, and about the assumptions that had carried them across continents and into captivity. And as those questions accumulated, they opened new angles, logistical, leadership-driven, and psychological, that would deepen the impact of a single, carefully regulated meal. The logistical angle. Behind the apparent simplicity of a Thanksgiving meal lay a system designed to operate without exception. Feeding hundreds of thousands of prisoners across a continent required planning measured in rail cars, slaughter quotas, and inventory sheets. Turkey did not appear in POW camps by accident. It arrived because it had been calculated. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps coordinated food distribution nationally. Military bases, training camps, hospitals, and prisoner-of-war facilities were all fed through the same administrative channels. When Thanksgiving menus were approved for American troops, POW camps were included automatically. Excluding them would have required additional paperwork, additional justification, and additional scrutiny. From a logistical perspective, consistency was easier than discrimination. Turkeys were sourced regionally. In agricultural states, local suppliers filled contracts. In others, frozen shipments arrived by rail. Kitchens adjusted portion sizes to meet caloric requirements. No extra rations were added. Nothing was symbolic. The meal fit within existing allowances. This mattered because it meant the Thanksgiving turkey was not generosity. It was efficiency. A system functioning at scale cannot improvise morality. It applies rules uniformly or it breaks down. By feeding prisoners the same holiday meal as base troops, the U.S. Army avoided creating exceptions that could complicate oversight or provoke complaints during Red Cross inspections. The result was paradoxical. What felt extraordinary to prisoners was, to administrators, simply another line item fulfilled. The leadership angle. At the camp level, commanders bore responsibility for maintaining order. They walked a narrow line. Too harsh, and camps risked unrest, international criticism, and reciprocal abuse of American POWs. Too lenient, and discipline could erode. Thanksgiving tested that balance. Some officers anticipated problems. Would prisoners see the meal as weakness? Would it encourage demands? Would it undermine authority? Reports from earlier months suggested otherwise. Prisoners responded better to predictable treatment than to fluctuations. Consistency reduced tension. Commanders were instructed to observe reactions but not intervene unless necessary. Guards were told to maintain standard posture. No speeches. No apologies. No acknowledgement that the meal was unusual. By refusing to frame the event emotionally, leadership ensured it remained administrative, not performative. This restraint reflected confidence. A leadership that fears perception seeks control through symbolism. A leadership secure in its authority relies on routine. The camps reflected the latter. Thanksgiving passed without incident not because prisoners were placated, but because nothing in the system suggested the rules had changed. For many commanders, the absence of problems confirmed the effectiveness of policy. Humane treatment did not weaken control. It reinforced it. The psychological warfare angle. Although not designed as psychological warfare, the Thanksgiving meal functioned as one nonetheless, precisely because it was unintended. Psychological operations typically rely on messaging, repetition, and reinforcement. This moment relied on none of those. It worked through contradiction. Prisoners had been taught that America was decadent and cruel. They encountered an enemy that was procedural and restrained. They expected deprivation. They encountered sufficiency. They anticipated punishment. They received regulation. This dissonance did not convert beliefs instantly. It destabilized them. Military psychologists would later note that belief systems fracture more effectively when reality contradicts expectation repeatedly and quietly. The Thanksgiving meal became part of a larger pattern. Medical care without coercion, mail delivery without manipulation, labor assignments without brutality. By not exploiting these contradictions overtly, the U.S. inadvertently strengthened their impact. Prisoners concluded on their own that some assumptions had been false. That realization carried more weight than any lecture. The effect extended beyond individuals. Camp culture shifted subtly. Hardline ideological prisoners found it more difficult to enforce strict conformity. Doubt was contagious. Conversations changed tone. Certainty softened at the edges. Importantly, this did not produce loyalty to the United States. It produced uncertainty about absolutes. In war, that shift mattered. As winter deepened, Thanksgiving receded into memory. But its imprint remained. It became a reference point. A moment when the enemy behaved in a way that did not fit the script. That script had guided German soldiers into battle. Now, inside American camps, it was being rewritten slowly, meal by meal, regulation by regulation. And as 1944 approached, the cumulative effect of these quiet contradictions would converge with events beyond the wire. Battles, invasions, and defeats that would transform disbelief into realization, and realization into a decisive turning point. Thanksgiving did not explode into significance on the day it occurred. Its power unfolded gradually, measured not in reaction but in accumulation. In the days that followed November 1943, the camps returned to routine. Roll calls resumed at the same hours. Work details marched out under guard. Kitchens reverted to standard menus. On paper, nothing had changed. Inside the prisoners, something had. The German soldiers began to compare. Not emotionally, but practically. They compared the meal to what they had eaten before capture. To what they imagined their families were eating at home. To the letters they received, thin descriptions of shortages, ration cards, and substitutions. The Thanksgiving turkey became a fixed reference point, quietly anchoring a widening gap between expectation and reality. As winter progressed, news arrived from Europe. Allied landings in Italy. The bombing of German cities intensifying. Reports of shortages deepening. Prisoners listened to guarded radio broadcasts. They read newspapers under supervision. The outside war began to intrude into the enclosed world of the camps more forcefully. By early 1944, the contrast was undeniable. Some prisoners had been farmers, factory workers, clerks before the war. They understood logistics. They understood production. They recognized that the United States was not straining to provide food. It was managing abundance. The Thanksgiving meal, once viewed as anomaly, now appeared as evidence. Officers took note as well. Senior NCOs reported subtle discipline changes. Prisoners complied more readily with camp regulations. Work details became more efficient. Attempts at ideological enforcement weakened. Hardline loyalists still existed, but their authority diminished as lived experience undermined rigid narratives. American camp reports reflected this shift. Morale among prisoners was described as stable or resigned. Incidents declined. Escape attempts remained rare. Thanksgiving was never cited explicitly. It did not need to be. Its influence was embedded in the trend. Then, in June 1944, the war reached a point of no return. The Normandy landings arrived through radio and newspapers. Prisoners gathered silently, absorbing details. Beaches secured. Allied troops advancing inland. German defenses under pressure. For many, this was the first confirmation that the war they had imagined was no longer the war being fought. The camps did not erupt. There were no riots or celebrations. But the psychological terrain shifted decisively. Thanksgiving, months earlier, had planted doubt. Normandy confirmed it. As summer passed into autumn, another Thanksgiving approached. This time, the prisoners knew what to expect. The 1944 Thanksgiving meal was received differently. Less shock. More recognition. The turkey no longer symbolized confusion. It symbolized continuity. The Americans were consistent. The rules held. The system endured. For prisoners, that consistency contrasted sharply with developments at home. Germany's situation deteriorated rapidly. Cities were devastated. Supply lines fractured. Civilian hunger intensified. The letters arriving at camps grew shorter, more cautious. Some stopped altogether. The Thanksgiving meal now carried weight beyond itself. It was no longer just food. It was proof of strategic imbalance. A nation that could maintain tradition, feed its soldiers and its prisoners, and fight on multiple fronts simultaneously possessed an advantage that ideology alone could not overcome. American authorities observed these changes carefully. There was no celebration, no declaration of success. The goal had never been to win hearts. It had been to manage prisoners efficiently until the war ended. Yet by late 1944, the cumulative effect was clear. The prisoners' relationship to the war had shifted from belief to observation, from certainty to acceptance. The Thanksgiving turkey had become part of that journey, not as a turning point in isolation, but as a marker along a path that led inevitably toward acknowledgement of defeat. And as the year drew to a close, with Allied forces pressing toward Germany's borders, the quiet realization spreading through American POW camps set the stage for the final transformation, when captivity would no longer feel temporary, and the meaning of that holiday meal would crystallize fully in the shadow of collapse. By early 1945, the psychological distance between the prisoners and the war they had fought had become unmistakable. The American camps were unchanged, barbed wire still stood, guards still rotated shifts, mess halls still followed schedules, but the world beyond them was unraveling at speed. News arrived not as rumor, but as confirmation. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. Cities fell. German units surrendered in masses no longer measured in companies, but in entire armies. Inside the camps, the prisoners no longer debated whether defeat was possible. They debated what it would mean. Thanksgiving, now part of memory rather than immediacy, returned as a reference point in these discussions. It had marked the moment when many realized that the enemy they faced was not improvising survival, but sustaining dominance. The meal had signaled capacity, industrial, logistical, and institutional, that Germany could no longer match. As spring approached, the final collapse accelerated. Reports of shortages in Germany hardened into descriptions of starvation. Civilians scavenged. Infrastructure failed. In contrast, American camps continued without visible strain. Food portions remained steady. Medical care continued. Order held. For prisoners, this contrast forced a final reckoning. The narrative that had justified sacrifice, that hardship was temporary and victory inevitable, could no longer withstand comparison. The The Thanksgiving turkey, once puzzling, now appeared as an early indicator of the imbalance that would end the war. American officers noticed the shift. Intelligence summaries noted reduced ideological resistance. Prisoners discussed post-war life more frequently. Some asked about work opportunities in the United States after release. Others spoke of rebuilding Germany. The war, for them, was already becoming history. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the camps did not erupt. There was no celebration, no chaos. The news arrived, and it was absorbed quietly. Many prisoners had known it was coming long before the official announcement. The realization had unfolded gradually, through news reports, letters, and moments like Thanksgiving that contradicted everything they had been told. In the days following surrender, American policy emphasized stability. Prisoners were informed of repatriation plans. Order was maintained. Food rations continued unchanged. There was no triumphalism. Victory expressed itself through control, not spectacle. For some prisoners, the memory of Thanksgiving returned sharply in these final weeks. It stood out as the first moment when captivity had forced them to confront reality rather than ideology. Not because it was kind, but because it was consistent. A system confident enough to follow its own rules, even when no one would have noticed if it did not. As preparations for repatriation began, medical inspections and administrative processing intensified. Prisoners were evaluated, documented, and scheduled for transport. Many would return to a Germany they barely recognized, physically or psychologically. The American camps had preserved their bodies. The war had dismantled their certainties. In post-war interviews and memoirs, some former prisoners would recall Thanksgiving not as a pleasant memory, but as a disturbing one. It did not make them feel welcomed. It made them feel outmatched. It forced an acknowledgement that the war had been lost not only on battlefields, but in systems of production, organization, and restraint. The turning point, in hindsight, was never the meal itself. It was what the meal represented: a nation at war that could afford to follow the rules, maintain traditions, and feed even those it fought. And as prisoners prepared to leave the camps that had once seemed temporary, the full consequence of that realization began to unfold, carried with them into a shattered homeland, and into an aftermath that would redefine how the war was remembered. The end of the war did not immediately end captivity. For German prisoners in the United States, surrender marked the beginning of a new phase, one defined by waiting, reassessment, and gradual release. The camps remained operational. Guards stayed at their posts. Meals continued to arrive on schedule. The machinery of custody did not stop simply because the fighting had. Repatriation took time. The United States now held hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers whose home country lay in ruins. Transport capacity was limited. Europe's ports were damaged. Rail lines were broken. Meanwhile, American authorities faced another calculation: whether returning prisoners immediately to a devastated Germany would worsen humanitarian conditions there. For months, many German POWs remained in American camps. They worked on farms, in lumberyards, and in reconstruction projects under supervision. Pay rates were modest but regulated. Medical care continued. The Geneva Convention still applied. In this extended period, the psychological impact of captivity deepened. With the war over, prisoners began to process their experiences not as temporary hardship, but as a chapter completed. Thanksgiving, now remembered alongside other moments of contradiction, was discussed more openly. It became a reference point in conversations about how the war had truly been fought. American reports from 1945 and 1946 noted high levels of compliance and low levels of unrest among German POWs. The feared wave of resentment never materialized. Instead, most prisoners focused on survival and return. Some expressed concern about conditions in Germany. Others worried about political retribution. A few asked about staying in the United States, though such options were limited. Red Cross evaluations conducted after the surrender confirmed that U.S. camps had maintained standards throughout the war. Food quality, including holiday rations, was cited as consistent with regulations. These reports would later serve as benchmarks in post-war discussions about lawful conduct in wartime. For American personnel, The camps wound down methodically. Branch camps closed first. Prisoners were consolidated into larger facilities. Records were finalized. Equipment was inventoried. The war effort shifted toward demobilization. Yet the consequences of captivity extended beyond logistics. Former prisoners carried their experiences home. In Germany, stories spread quietly about adequate food, fair treatment, and unexpected moments like Thanksgiving meals in American camps. These accounts did not absolve the enemy, but they complicated the narrative of universal cruelty. In a country struggling to understand defeat, such complexity mattered. Thanksgiving, in retrospect, stood out not because it was generous, but because it was normal. In a war defined by extremes, normalcy carried its own weight. It demonstrated that conflict did not eliminate structure, and that restraint could coexist with victory. As repatriation accelerated in late 1946, trains carried former prisoners back across an ocean they had crossed under guard years earlier. They returned thinner in certainty, older in perspective, and aware that the enemy they had feared had defeated them not only through force, but through endurance. And as these men stepped back onto European soil, the long-term consequences of that realization, shaped in part by a single holiday meal, began to influence how the war would be remembered, discussed, and judged in the years that followed. Repatriation completed by the summer of 1946, the German POWs returned to a homeland unrecognizable from the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins. Railroads, bridges, and factories had been destroyed. Food was scarce. Families were fractured, and the population struggled under rationing, displacement, and political upheaval. For many returning soldiers, the memories of American camps, particularly the Thanksgiving meals, stood in stark contrast to the reality at home. Former prisoners reflected on this contrast in memoirs, letters, and interviews. Some described it as a moral shock. The enemy, whom they had been trained to hate, had treated them with predictable fairness and had followed the rules even when unnecessary. The Thanksgiving meal became emblematic of this realization. It was not a feast of kindness. It was an example of order, consistency, and logistical mastery. For those who had been steeped in Nazi ideology, it quietly undermined what they had been taught about the nature of the enemy. Reports collected by the U.S. Army after the war reinforced this perspective. Officers noted that prisoners who had been exposed to holiday meals and structured treatment were calmer, more compliant, and more willing to cooperate during repatriation. Food, discipline, and administration had been tools not of propaganda, but of strategic management, producing psychological effects without ever intending to manipulate hearts or beliefs overtly. At the societal level, the experience of American captivity contributed to a broader understanding of the war's moral and operational dimensions. It highlighted that victory could coexist with restraint, that efficiency and fairness could project power as effectively as force, and that humane treatment of enemies could influence post-war reconciliation. Former prisoners, carrying these lessons, sometimes shared them quietly with families and peers in Germany. Such stories complicated the post-war narrative, adding nuance to accounts dominated by suffering, destruction, and revenge. The impact of these experiences endured beyond individual memory. Scholars examining POW treatment noted that American adherence to Geneva Convention standards, regular rations, medical care, and predictable routines reinforced international norms in the post-war period. The contrast between POW well-being in the United States and civilian hardship in Germany underscored the importance of logistics, discipline, and humane management in wartime conduct. By the late 1940s, the image of American POW camps had become a touchstone in historical studies. Thanksgiving, in particular, was cited not as an act of charity, but as an illustration of how order and consistency could shape perception, influence morale, and subtly affect belief systems. Prisoners who had once anticipated cruelty now understood that the enemy's strength was systemic, rooted in industry, governance, and law, not solely in bullets or bombs. As repatriation concluded and the world moved toward reconstruction, the American POW system left behind more than records and reports. It left lessons about strategy, ethics, and human behavior. For those who experienced it firsthand, the memory of that first Thanksgiving turkey lingered as a quiet, formative marker, a reminder that the war had been waged not only with weapons, but with rules, organization, and the steady rhythm of an institution that could feed its enemies while fighting the world's deadliest conflict. The stage was now set for reflection, a calm appraisal of what such moments revealed about humanity, warfare, and the choices made under the shadow of global conflict. The Thanksgiving turkey served to German prisoners in American camps was more than a meal. It was a moment of quiet revelation, a juncture where expectation collided with reality. In the midst of a global war defined by deprivation, brutality, and ideological extremism, a simple, predictable act of sustenance revealed a larger truth. That warfare is not only fought with weapons, but with systems, discipline, and law. The men who received that meal did not smile or cheer. Many remained silent, their reactions measured, their minds working through contradictions. For some, it became a seed of doubt, about the enemy, about the ideology they had followed, and about the assumptions that had carried them across battlefields and oceans. For others, it became a point of comparison, a benchmark against which the collapse of Germany would later be measured. From a historical perspective, the event illustrates the interplay between morality, logistics, and strategy. By adhering to rules consistently, even during a national holiday, the United States demonstrated a form of power often invisible on the battlefield. It was power exercised quietly, without spectacle, yet with lasting psychological and operational effects. The POWs were fed not as an act of generosity, but because a disciplined system demanded it. And in that discipline lay influence. The lesson is subtle but profound. Humanity persists even in conflict when structures allow it. Law, order, and foresight can achieve outcomes that coercion alone cannot. The Thanksgiving meal, small as it was in the vast narrative of World War II, revealed that restraint could be as consequential as force, and that ordinary acts, measured, regulated, consistent, can shape perception, belief, and ultimately, history. In the end, the shock experienced by those German prisoners was not simply about food. It was about understanding that victory was not defined solely by bullets or bombs, but by the capacity to maintain organization, fairness, and predictability amidst chaos. That understanding endured long after the war, echoing in memories, memoirs, and the moral calculus of future conflicts, a testament to the quiet power of human order amidst the devastation of war.